welcome to our webinar series. And today I am happy to introduce Elizabeth Barnes, who is our exotic forest pest specialist. And she came here first she got her undergraduate at Holyoke and studying biology, and then she got her PhD at the University of Denver working with Shannon Murphy, where she developed quite a reputation as a lepidopteran ecologist, which I don't have to define to you in this audience. Thank goodness for that. So since she came here in late fall of 2018, she's been helping us run Emerald Ash Borer University and our Forest Pest Outreach Survey Program, and helping us develop our social media presence. So I'm really lucky to have a fellow entomologist who actually publishes in better journals than I do to help me investigate, help us figure out how we can better use the different types of media that we have to get people to learn about invasive species, report invasive species, and then act on them. So today, Elizabeth's going to talk to us about our 10 years of experience with our webinar program called Emerald Ash Borer University. So take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Cliff. As Cliff said, I'm going to be talking about our webinar program today. I did want to mention at the beginning, I also do a lot of other sorts of outreach programs and science communication programs. So if that's something you're at all interested in, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always excited to talk to people and, bounce ideas off each other or share resources that I have. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge our partners. We're not doing this by ourselves. Ohio State has been, the Ohio State University has been working with us, Michigan State University, and then also the U.S. Forest Service. First off, I just want to apologize if there's any background noise. Unfortunately, the way my apartment is set up, I can't put these guys in another room. So if you hear some scuffling, that's the lizard. And if you hear some meowing, that's my cat, who always likes to circle me and meow whenever I'm giving one of these talks, unfortunately. So sorry about that. Overall, I'm going to start out by explaining why we decided to do this webinar series even before COVID became an issue and everyone was forced online. Then I'll go over how we ran it, then talk a little bit about our results and discuss them a little bit, and then finally end with some recommendations about tips that you can use if you're doing your own online programming, or some of them I think might apply to more in-person programming as well. First off, just to give a brief overview of what invasive species are, I think most of you have a good idea, but since the definition varies from group to group, I thought I'd just kind of start out with a general definition. So invasive species are organisms that are transported from one area to another, usually by humans. When they get to that new location, they escape out of captivity, cultivation, or whatever it is they hitchhiked over on, get out into the wider wild, and establish a reproducing population. Once they're there, they cause harm to people or the environment. For example, I have an Asian longhorn beetle on the screen right now. This is a wood-boring insect that kills the trees that it infests in about 10 years. Once they get into a tree, they'll kill them. And they attack a wide range of hardwood trees. So if you lose most of the hardwood trees in your forest, that's obviously going to have a huge impact on the ecosystem, particularly in areas where hardwood trees are the predominant components of the forest. But that's also a huge issue if you're someone who makes your living off of those trees, whether that's something like harvesting lumber or making maple syrup out of the sap. And then finally, it also has an impact on homeowners because oftentimes trees increase the value of your home. They're also just, generally nice to look at, pleasant to look at. And they also can do things like offer shade, which can cool your home in the summertime. So harm to people and the environment. I'd also like to go over a simplified version of the stages of an accidental introduction. Again, this is not applying to every type of invasive species introduction. It's just the accidental ones. It's just a simplified version. but I think it's useful to go over this so that I can discuss the different points where we do different types of outreach and why we do that type of outreach at those stages. The first stage is when the organism initially hops onto something to hitchhike to a new location. This is when the organism is still in its native range. For example, here I've got a little emerald ash borer that's getting into some pallets, which are then used for shipping things overseas. At this stage, you can do all sorts of things to prevent the transportation of these insects. For example, you can heat treat the wood, you can use insecticides, you can do inspections. There's a wide range of things that you can do at this point. And this is really the best stage to stop those introductions because, well, it hasn't even left its native range yet. The next stage is when the organism arrives in port, but it hasn't actually escaped out into the wider area yet. It's still contained somehow within the warehouse or the area that the shipping crates have arrived into. This is also a really good stage to stop an invasion because these insects haven't started a reproducing population yet usually, and so it's much easier to get a few insects eradicated than it is a whole bunch of them in areas that you don't know for sure all the areas that it's in. At this stage, we do a lot of outreach to people. Well, we do a lot of outreach to people who work in those warehouses to teach them what they should do if they happen to see, a weird insect flying around or sickly plants or something like that, so that we can catch them in this early stage. However, if that doesn't work, the next stage is when they have an established reproducing population, but it's still contained in the area of that initial introduction. Sort of in the last stage and also in this stage, we do a lot of work teaching people what they should do if they see these insects, which is tell us, please report it to us so that we can try and get them under control. We also do a lot of outreach trying to encourage people to not do things that will spread them further. The biggest campaign, at least in our world around this, is the Don't Move Firewood campaign, because a lot of forest pests are transported really far in firewood. In fact, for most of the invasive insects that I deal with, they don't spread very far on their own. They're spread primarily by people who do something that allows these insects to hitch a ride. The big one at the moment is spotted lanternfly, which some of you might know about, which is an insect that's spreading on the East Coast. It's been able to hop a lot of counties into other states. And most of those introductions are believed to have been by humans because they're not very good flyers. So we try to prevent the further spread, and then finally we'll teach people about what we know about actually controlling and managing them in things like specific trees that are, say, historically important. However, it's hard to do a lot of that type of management at this point because often the insects aren't an issue in their home range. So there's just not a good information about management practices from there, or they might be behaving differently in their new range. And so we're kind of starting from scratch a lot of times either way. So we'll make recommendations that we can, but we're more limited. As the insects start to spread further, usually we have a better idea of how to manage them. So we will often start emphasizing those management techniques more. We still encourage people to not do things that spread the insects further, and also still encourage them to report it, particularly on those border areas at the edge of where its range is expanding, and also in other parts of the country where there's good habitat for the insects, so it's a potential introduction site. Then finally, we have the final stage where the organism has basically spread into all the different types of habitat across the country that they can reasonably live in. At this stage, the focus shifts a lot more from trying to stop the spread and more into how do we live with it now that it's here, because we're probably not going to be able to eradicate it. Our outreach, we still do occasionally some stuff about reporting at this stage that specific insect, because it can be useful to see how, say, populations are fluctuating. But we focus much more on teaching people how to live with them now that they're here, and also letting people know about some of the research we're doing behind the scenes, to try and get the insects under control, at least, so they're not causing as much harm. And that can be things like biocontrol or breeding trees that are resistant to the insect or disease. So our outreach program really focuses on these last three stages. In the first two stages, there's a very limited and specific group of people who can have an effect on the spread of the insects at that stage. We do a tiny bit of that. We talk to people about a tiny bit of that, but really we're focused primarily on these last three stages. All right, so now that I've told you all the things that we want to share with people and communicate with people, what do they actually want from us? And what might hinder our communication efforts? Well, there was a really interesting set of studies that came out in 2015 out of California. I've got the citation there at the bottom if you want to look it up, or I can also just send you the PDF if you're interested, where they asked people who were managing invasive species what they wanted to know from researchers, and then compared that to what they actually got from researchers. And there's a lot to dig into in those papers, but the two things that I think are the most important for what I'm going to talk about today are, first, that people really wanted specific actionable information. They wanted to know, okay, I'm on the ground, I'm trying to deal with these organisms. What do I do? How do I handle it? How do I handle it in my specific situation? And then the other thing they really wanted was were more timely updates on management recommendations. And a lot of times they would mention that they were aware that research was going on, but they weren't getting those updates as it occurred. So I think this is really understandable from both the perspective of the managers and also from the researchers. In terms of specific actionable information, it makes perfect sense that if you're on the ground, you'd want those details. You need those details. You're trying to keep these things under control, which is already a hard enough job to begin with. But on the side of the researchers, when we publish, we don't want to exceed kind of the bounds of what our experiment showed. We don't want to, overstep and speculate, because the situation might be different in other settings. So we don't want to, make too broad of statements. And also, we just don't have the time or space to necessarily go into every single detail in every single space. In terms of timely updates, again, if you're dealing with a thing that's spreading, you want to know the most up-to-date recommendations as it goes. But if you're a researcher, it takes a lot of time to get this data. You have to collect it, you have to run your experiments, then you have to analyze your data, then you have to write up the paper, and then you have to go through the publication process, and then you have to do revisions, and then it takes a while for it actually to come out. So the point is, all of you, most of you at least, have been through this, and you know how long it takes. So what's really needed is some things that can act as sort of an in-between to fill this gap between those things that are published in journals and the kind of details that managers regularly need. One really great solution to this is in-person events, because you can usually present data that you're still collecting with a caveat that it's in process, it's not ready for publication, but you're seeing some trends that might allow you to make some updated recommendations. You can also interact directly with people more easily there, so that they can ask you specific questions. And even if you don't have an answer at that point, you can say, email me later, or here's this other person that I think might have an answer for you. So things like going to meetings and giving talks, hosting your own events, setting up tables. These are all really great ways to kind of fill that gap. And, we do all of these things in our own programs. I think they're really important. Even though I'm going to talk about webinars today and how great they can be, I I think that in-person events are still vital to do, and there's a lot you can get out of them. That said, there's also a downside to them. They can take a lot of time to attend. You've got travel time, you've got all the time you spend at the event. Sometimes you have to like book a hotel, so there's that. And then they can also be really expensive. And this goes for both the people attending and the people giving presentations. So it's somewhat limiting because you have to pick and choose which ones you either go to or run, depending on which side of this you're on, over a given year. So something else that you can do to kind of fill in this gap is do something online like a webinar where there's no travel time and it only costs the amount of money to have an internet capable device, internet, and then for the person running it, you usually need some sort of license like with Zoom. So with that, I'm going to tell you what we decided to do. Our original goals when we set up Emerald Ash Borer University were that we wanted to make invasive species information more accessible to a wider variety of people. This was particularly important at the time because we were dealing with the rapidly spreading emerald ash borer, which was already in several states and predicted to spread into even more. So there was a need to get the information out there, but you had to also get it to a wide geographic area. We also wanted to find a way to connect decision makers and researchers. And by decision makers, I mean everyone from the people writing the laws about invasive species management to the people on the ground doing the management, like foresters and arborists, to the homeowner who has an ash tree that they really love and they'd like to save. We also wanted to use this as a way to encourage people to report invasive species more broadly. So we set up Emerald Ash Borer University, which is a webinar program. We run 5 webinars in the fall, 5 webinars in the spring, and we've been doing it for the last 10 years. So we've got a really great data set to work with for this. We started out, like I said, focused primarily on emerald ash borer, but quickly broadened our topics to include other sorts of invasive insects. And also more recently, we've been doing more pathogens as well, invasive pathogens. Our webinars are about an hour long with 50 minutes for the talk and about 10 minutes for questions. We have speakers from primarily universities and state and federal employees, although we occasionally have people from outside of that. And we record all of our webinars and we post them online after each webinar. We started posting them originally on the Michigan State website, but then we switched it over to YouTube because we were hoping to first off get just, save Michigan State some space, because 10 years worth of hour-long videos kind of adds up over time. And they had to maintain that, they had to host it. It was a lot to ask of them. And also we thought maybe by switching it over to YouTube, we could broaden our audience a little bit. Our target audience were people who are decision makers. By that, again, I mean people who are making management decisions, public policy decisions, and decisions about their own home, and people who are engaged in outreach and extension, and then finally people who are nature engaged. And what I mean by that is people who are aware of their natural surroundings and would notice, hey, there's this weird beetle. I've lived here for 50 years. I've never seen this before. And we wanted to get them to think, that's odd, I should tell someone. We advertised as broadly as we could, both online and in person, using things like newsletters, flyers, and social media. And we also offered continuing education credits. Just a quick side note here for the CEUs. This was really important for our webinars, and I know a lot of people tend to be hesitant to apply for pre-approval for CEUs. It's a pretty easy process. I would recommend doing it if you think it would be at all applicable. reach out to these people and ask. It's not that it takes a little time to set up, but it's very much worthwhile. We also wanted to kind of assess our audience and assess how we were doing. So we sent out in the short term surveys immediately following each webinar to everyone who tuned in live for the webinar. And then also we did a long-term survey this past spring where we wanted to find out if people actually followed through with the things they said they would do in the short-term survey. In those surveys, these are the general questions that we wanted to answer. I'm not going through each specific survey question. That would just take a while. So we wanted to know who our audience was because we needed to know if we were hitting that target. We wanted to know if it was actually meaningful to them because if they didn't enjoy it and get something out of it, they're probably not going to come back in the future. So this was particularly important in the short-term surveys so that we could evaluate how we were doing and change things if necessary. We also wanted to know if we had a wide geographic reach. Remember, one of the points of doing things online instead of in person is that you can reach people, say, across the country rather than just in your own state. We wanted to know if the audience changed their behavior based on the message of our webinar, particularly in areas like management, outreach, and public policy. And then finally, we were hoping to find out if our viewers shared the information they learned in the webinars with someone else. This is important because we're hoping to kind of go for a sort of loose train the trainer model, not a very formal version of that, but the idea being we give the information to the people who watch our webinars, then they go out and share it with their local stakeholders. And because they are more local, they're better able to figure out what would be relevant usually. They are more trusted because they're a known quantity in the community. And they also know how to pitch things to people because again, they're familiar with the culture and the place that they're living. We also wanted to look at our recorded webinars and learn what's the longevity of them. Is it worth it for us to be recording them and posting them afterwards? We did this by looking at the number of views and also the length of views, which the length of views we only have for the YouTube videos. And then finally, we also looked at the traffic sources because we were interested in how people were finding our recorded webinars. Where were they coming from? Okay, now I'm going to get into our results, and just a quick note, this is actually a paper that is currently in revisions. It's going to be published in Environmental Entomology. So if you are at all interested in knowing all the details, because I can't get into all of them today, I'm happy to send you that paper. I will start out by going over our results for the demographics and quality. We found that our audience was really the group of people we were hoping to reach. They were primarily people who were professionally engaged in invasive species outreach or management. And the non-professionals were people who were either able to directly manage trees like homeowners, or people who were involved in both management and outreach for a hobby that they would invest quite a bit of time in. So that would be the master gardeners and naturalists. So overall, we were really pleased we're hitting the audience we want. In terms of our geographic reach, again, we've had a pretty wide reach, although it is concentrated in Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, which are the 3 states where the people running these programs live. I think that makes a certain amount of sense because A, that's where Emerald Ash Borer started, and B, we just know the distribution networks better for our own states for advertising the webinars. But that said, we did still get a lot of viewers from the rest of the Midwest and the Northeast, as well as some in the West and in the South. So I would say we had a wide geographic reach, and we're able to spread this information pretty far. And then the other thing to mention is that our speakers were not necessarily local speakers. They were from all over the country. And so we were able to connect speakers from all over the country with people from all over the country. We also asked our audience if they felt like the webinar was meaningful to them for whether the webinar was relevant and whether it was high quality. We had an over 90% positive response rate, which is great. They liked it. Awesome. In terms of whether they felt it improved their subject matter or they felt better prepared to manage the pest, we had a little over 70% positive response rate for both of those, which is, it's a little lower than the first two, but I think it's still respectable overall. In terms of improving the knowledge of the subject matter, some of that is people maybe not getting the information they wanted, but I think a lot of it is also due to our audience, which are people who are already pretty well educated in invasive species. In terms of whether or not they felt better prepared to manage the pest, again, it could be some of those things I just mentioned, but also not every single one of our webinars was about management. So it makes sense that it would be a little lower there. Okay, so to sum that up, we reached people who were actively and regularly engaged in outreach and management. We had a wide geographic reach and we had an overall positive response. So from this, I would say webinars seem to work well at reaching the audiences we were hoping to reach, and people seem to like them. I know there's probably going to be a little bit of COVID fatigue in terms of webinars, but in the long term, I think webinars are based on this really worth doing. Next, I'll talk about any changes in behavior or sharing that people did. First, I looked at the audience, the things that people said that they would do in the short term. Overall, we had most people say that yes, they would take an action based on the webinars. Then we asked them to give a specific action in an open-ended question. And here's what we found. So most people said that they would share the information. Around 37% said they would share the information, and then about 15% said they would make a plan, monitor, survey, change or start treatment, or do further research. This is great. It was an open-ended question, so we weren't specifically prompting them, and they were telling us that they were going to do the sorts of things that we wanted them to get from our webinars. So this is really exciting. The one thing that was less exciting is around 3% said that they would report invasive species based on our webinar, but just put a mental pin in that because I've got some more data a little bit later that might explain why that number is so low. We then followed up in the long term to see if people actually did the things they said they were going to do. Particularly, we're interested if the information from the webinar helped with things like managing invasive species. Around 60% said yes. Creating or changing public policy, about 15%, and helping with outreach or extension or education, and around 80% said yes to this. For managing invasive species, that's a little lower than I would necessarily expect, but again, not everyone in our audience is actually actively engaged in management, or they might not have ended up encountering the species that that was the topic of the webinar they watched. For creating public policy, I know 15% seems like a low number, but given how many people are actually regularly involved in public policy, I think that's a decent response. It could be higher, but I'm pretty happy with it. And then finally, for outreach and extension, again, that's a decently high number, even though particularly given that, again, not everyone in our audience is someone who does outreach or extension, would define themselves that way. Excuse me. Okay, so coming back to that question about why reporting was so low in the first survey. In our follow-up survey, we asked people if they were more likely to report invasive species because of our webinar, already knew how to report, or were less likely to report. About 43% said they were more likely to report invasive species, which is awesome. That's a lot higher than the 3%. I would guess that they just didn't think to write that down, but they still got the message. About 55% said that they already knew to report invasive species. So that gets back to that thing where a lot of our audience is professionally engaged in invasive species management or outreach. So they would already know to report coming in, so they wouldn't say that our webinars taught them how to report invasive species. And then finally, about 2% said they were less likely to report. I've got 3 ideas for this. First, maybe the message got crossed somewhere and they misinterpreted something we said. The second is they could have just clicked the wrong button. I've seen signs that that might have happened in the past. And then finally, for species like emerald ash borer that are really very widely spread now, particularly in Indiana, we're moving away from telling people to report and we're encouraging them to do other things. So they might have taken away that they shouldn't report emerald ash borer anymore. Next, I want to look at the number of people that they said they would share the information with. And we gave this as a multiple choice question with different categories. So 1 to 10 people, 11 to 20 people, etc. So this is one of the more exciting parts of our results. So we had around 28% said that they would share it with 1 to 10 people, but then most of the rest of our respondents were sharing it with 21 or more people, and about 25% said that they shared it with over 100 people, which is awesome. This is the sort of reach we want, where we are teaching a group of people that will then go out and teach other people about our message, spreading it even wider. Now, I'd like to try and break that down a little bit more. And first off, I'm aware that probably not every single one of the views that we've gotten over the years was a unique person. I know that I've watched multiple webinars, so some of those views are me watching 10 webinars, and so it looks like 10 views. I also know that our survey may not necessarily be completely representative of the wider group of people who are watching our webinars, but I think it's still worth doing the calculations to kind of get a general sense of the overall final reach of the message. So starting out with the total number of views, and then I'm taking that number and multiplying it times the percent that were in each category. For example, for the 1 to 10 category, that's 28% of people. Multiply that times 51,000, you get about 14,000 views. And then we do that for the rest of them. Then we take that number and we figure out what the low range would be. So if you had shared it with 1 to 10 viewers, say most people really only shared it with one person, we take that 14,000, multiply it times 1, get about 14,000, do it with the rest of the people, add that up and get a total of a low end of a reach of about 2,071,000 people that it was shared with. Then we do the same thing with the high end of the spectrum. So take 14,000, multiply it times 10, get 143,000 and change. And then add that all up, we get around 3,013,000 or more people who the message was finally reached with. But that's probably not the actual final reach. So say only 10% of the total viewers, fit all the criteria so that this is an accurate representation of them. That's still around 207,000 to around 300,000 additional people reached through these webinars. And if we're really generous and we say it's representative of 25%, that bumps it up to around 517,000 to around 753,000 people reached. Which is greatly expanding the final reach of our program and our message. And again, just to take it away from the numbers and pull it back a little bit, this is about invasive species management. This is about a real problem out in the world that we're trying to deal with. And we need to reach as many people as possible to try and deal with it, because we can't be everywhere at once. We also asked them who they shared it with. And I'm just going to show you the long-term results for this, but we also have it for the short term, and it's pretty similar. So people reported, most people said the general public, but people also said clients, colleagues, family, friends, government officials, master gardeners or naturalists. A few people said park, forest, or museum visitors, and then we had an other category. So to zoom in on one of these to try and understand kind of what this means and remind you about what this really means, I want to focus on those clients. So those are typically arborists or foresters who are saying they shared it with their clients. So let's do a quick scenario. So say a homeowner who doesn't know a lot about botany, forestry, entomology, any of that, has a tree in their yard that's looking sick and seems to be dying, and they don't really know what to make of it. So they reach out to an expert who deals with trees in general. They contact their arborist or forester. If that person has gotten a message from us about the most up-to-date invasive species management and the invasive insects that they would like them to be watching for, they know what to do if they encounter one of those. They know how to best manage those trees in ways that will best protect the trees from invasive species, or they know at what stage the tree is a lost cause and it really needs to be removed. And they also are more likely to notice signs of some of these insects that, haven't been introduced here, but they're on our radar. They're things that we're watching out for. So it's reaching the person who needs it. Then they go and they tell that to their client. So it's reaching the person who needs it, even though that homeowner, there's a good chance they wouldn't know to come to us for information. Their tree might be dying from emerald ash borer, but I've talked to lots and lots of people, and well-educated people. So this is people from all walks of life who I tell them what I do. I say, oh, have you noticed there are a lot of dead trees in the area? And they go, huh, yeah, now that you mentioned it, I have. And I say, well, there's a good chance that most of those have been killed by emerald ash borer. So they don't necessarily know the specific insect, they just notice something's wrong. So then they go to that arborist who has our information. So even though we're not directly giving it to the homeowner, it still gets there. So in summary, the information from our webinars was primarily used for outreach and management. Awesome, that's our goal. And it was widely shared. So we've got the number of people who are our viewers, but that's not the end of the reach of this program. It's actually much wider than that. Next, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about our recorded webinars and some of the results that we've got from that. First, just to start out with, I wanted to answer the question, how many more people are watching the recordings that we're posting versus people who watched it as it was streaming live. And to do that, I looked at the ratio of recorded views to live views. And here's what we found. We have a median of about 10 times as many people watching our recordings as watched live. And there are some impressive outliers, particularly that one that's way out at over 80 times as many people watching our recordings as watching our live webinars. Again, that's really expanding the final reach of our program. But we need to kind of drill down into this a little bit more. I've got some more questions. So one thing that I've noticed as I've watched other webinar programs is that a lot of times people don't post their webinars anywhere that's publicly accessible. Many of them will send a link out to everyone who pre-registered, but unless you get that email with the link, you can't find the recording. Sometimes they only keep it up for a month afterwards. So it's really limited to those people who knew about it ahead of time to register ahead of time. And they have to watch it within that, first month or two. Sometimes it gets left up a little longer, but it may be time limited. So what I wanted to find out was, do we get most of our views in the beginning, which would suggest that it's just the people who heard that initial announcement of the webinar and just couldn't watch it live? Or do we continue getting views as time progresses? And to do this, I pulled the data from YouTube and broke it down into 2-month brackets. We have some that data from the initial posting all the way to 45 months post-posting. And here, yes, initially we get most of our views, but more importantly, we continue to get views over time. Yes, we've got up and downs. There are some lags where we'll get no views on a video for months at a time, but then it'll suddenly spike up again. And these outliers, these high points, are not the same videos. They're all different videos that occasionally have spikes in viewership. Just to call your attention to one, there's a video that we posted, and 40 months after we initially released it, so years after we first posted it, we suddenly got 2 times as many people watching that recording as had watched the original live webinar. So this shows us that there's a good chance that new people are coming in and finding these webinars independent of our initial advertising campaign. And to be clear, once we post them, we're doing nothing. We post them, we leave them there. If people find them, awesome. If they don't find them, I mean, that's unfortunate, but they don't find them. We're not advertising them. We're not doing anything else. They are just sitting there. It's the same amount of work for us to record it and upload it at the beginning for the people who pre-registered as it is for us to leave it there and get those viewers down the road. Okay, but some of you might be saying, that's great, but how long are they actually watching? Because the typical recommendation for the length of an extension video is somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes. 5 minutes is supposed to be really pushing it. And our webinars are an hour long, which is significantly more than 5 minutes. So to look at this, I again broke it down by months since release, and I'm going to show this to you as just a trend line because it got hard to read in the other forms of the graph, and the trend line has a confidence interval around it. So, kind of mixed results here. So on one hand, it's 10 to 20 minute average watch time, which is better than the 5 minutes that's recommended, but it's also a lot less than that full 60 minutes of the webinar. And, people might be watching just the first 10 minutes. They might be skipping around. We don't really know. We don't have that information. And the other thing is, because of the way that YouTube gives us its data, we don't know the distribution of those views in each month. So we don't know if it's normally distributed. So really that 10 to 20 minutes is kind of standard. We don't know if it's bimodal distribution with most people only watching for a minute, or with some people only watching for a minute and some people watching for the full hour and not going along and not much going on in between. But either way, I think there's a way around this, which is to create both a short version of the webinar and also post the full length version. The short version for people who don't have the time or attention span or whatever to watch the full webinar, and the entire 60 minutes for all the people who really want the details. But I am well aware of how long it can take to edit down videos. I've tried to do this with some of our older videos, and it's very time consuming. There's a great paper, which I forgot to put the citation in, but I can send to you if you want it, where a group tried to go through their older videos that they had posted and edit them down to short little clips. And it took them like 3 to 4 hours per video to do that. And it did increase their viewership, but it was a very time consuming process. So what I suggest, and what we're trying out now, is asking your speakers to include either at the very beginning or at the very end a 5-minute summary of the high points of their talk. Then you can just go in, you can cut that out, post the 5-minute version and post the full length version, and it'll add a little bit of time. But from my experience, once you get used to the video editing software, it doesn't add more than like half an hour of work to your upload schedule. Now, finally, I'd like to go over the traffic sources to talk about how people are actually finding our webinars after we're posting them. And the percentages are not actually showing up on here. I'm not sure why, but if you want to know the details, I can send that to you. So we found that, and this is just for the recordings, we found that about half of the people found our webinars through YouTube. That means either they went onto YouTube, typed it into the search bar, found our webinar that way, or it was recommended to them in the sidebar. So something where they went to YouTube first and then were directed to our videos. The other, about a little less than half, found it through an external source. Unfortunately, a good proportion of that is unknown. But the next largest proportion is from our Emerald Ash Borer University website, which is part of a wider website that has other invasive species, other Emerald Ash Borer information. So you might go to the site for, Emerald Ash Borer distribution map, notice that we have videos and click through that way. Then About a quarter of people found it through various search engines, and the rest are primarily through links from other organizations that have invasive species programming that link directly to our webinars. I have a few takeaways for you from these results. The first is that if we weren't posting on YouTube, we would be missing half of our viewers, because those are people who don't know about our website, don't know about, emeraldashborer.info. They're going to YouTube because they know YouTube, and this is a little speculating, but based on how people use YouTube, they're going to YouTube, they're, searching for Emerald Ash Borer because they know that that's a good place to find a lot of videos about a lot of different information, and they're finding our webinars that way. So half of our viewership is because we're using this major streaming platform rather than, setting something up on our own website and hosting it that way. The other thing is that it's still worthwhile to have links on your own site, because a lot of people, they use other resources on our page, and then they might use other resources on our page and then stumble across it, or maybe they're aware of Emerald Ash Borer University, so they find the link that way. So we still think it's useful to have links on your own page. You just don't have to host the video itself there. In terms of the search engine, this also applies to YouTube. Based on some other results I didn't get to cover, I would say it's worthwhile to think about the types of search terms that people are going to use to find the sort of content you're presenting, and make sure that's included in the title so that search engines and YouTube, which is owned by Google, so uses a lot of the same things, pick up on and recommend your videos. And then also try and get people who have similar organizations to link to you, and in turn link back to them. You can get a lot of people finding your outreach product by linking back and forth, and usually all of our goals are about the same. We want to get people important information, so it's valuable to have those links between different sites. Okay, in summary, we got a lot more views on our recorded webinars, both in the short term and in the long term, but those views tended to be shorter. So we recommend posting a long version and a short version of your webinar to reach audiences that are there for all the details and audiences who just want a quick summary. Our traffic came from, a decent range of sources, but half of it came from YouTube. So using those pre-existing platforms can get you a lot of views you might not otherwise have. Finally, I'd like to talk about some recommendations. Here are just a few of the highlights of what we found. So first off, webinars are effective. Again, I know people are getting sick of them over COVID. I'm sorry that I'm subjecting you to one right now that you have to stare at a screen for, but thank you for listening. But I think moving forward, particularly after there's that initial phase where people are probably just going to be sick of it and only want to do things in person, it's worth incorporating webinars into your whole collection of things that you do for outreach. It can be really valuable. The second thing is really think about your target audience, both in terms of who will use the information you're sharing, but also who will further share that information, and try and take steps to reach them and to try and get them to tune in and listen to what you have to say. Because again, like the goal of this is, we think we've got some really important information about invasive species that could have a real impact on the world. We want as many people as possible to hear it. Third, use pre-existing platforms whenever you can. For us, that's using YouTube, but for you, that might be using something else. You don't need to start from scratch. It can take a lot of time to build these things. And also, sometimes you're missing out on a lot of people who, say, again, for us, already know about YouTube and find our information through YouTube. And then finally, if you can, get your speakers to do those quick 5-minute summaries so that you can clip that out and have the long and the short version. Now, to kind of wrap up here, the thing that I've been dancing around but not explicitly saying at any point is, our goal is to find the path of least resistance between us and the people who need this information. And I am well aware that sometimes it can be frustrating when you're doing outreach, because you feel like I've got this great information. It's really important. It could improve people's lives. Why aren't they listening to me? Well, people are busy. People are distracted. A good way I heard this described is think of people's attention as a form of currency. They've only got so much of it to give out at any given time. So you need to give them a good reason why it's valuable to them. And you can do this by checking in with them regularly to make sure that you know what they actually want to hear and you know what actually would be useful to them and valuable to them. Providing multiple versions of something. And I don't just mean that, short and long version of the webinars. I mean, you know, written forms, videos. Some people only have the attention for a sticker. So I'll give them a pretty sticker. And then if they see spotted lanternfly, they'll say, that looks like my sticker. I should go to this website and find out what I want to do. As many different forms as you can so that it's convenient for as many different people as possible. Also, offering incentives can be really helpful. Continuing education credits are great for that. It just kind of puts people over the edge into actually making the time to watch something because it's just a little more valuable to them. Another thing is for our surveys, we offer people goodie bags if they fill out our surveys, and they have general invasive species information, some stickers, magnets, and this little foldable tote bag with Emerald Ash Borer University branding on it. So hopefully more people will find our webinars. But I have honestly had people contact me and say that the only reason they're filling out our surveys is they want that bag because they like them so much. So it's useful to give people just a little bit more of an incentive to be involved in what you're doing. And again, I know a lot of you are very experienced in outreach, and you probably know a lot of this to begin with. But I think it's worth repeating. You're trying to make it as easy as possible, and you're trying to give people a reason to listen to you because there's a lot going on in the world at any given time, and you really need to give them that little bit of extra incentive and just make it a little easier. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone who helps run Emerald Ash Borer University, Robin Usborne, Amy Stone, Deb McCulloch, Cliff Sadoff, as well as everyone else who's worked on it and helped run it in my position over the years. And then finally, Canva, you don't actually have to give credit for Canva. It's free to use for anyone, but I always like to give it a little shout out because I found it really useful. So I want to tell other people about it. And thank you to the U.S. Forest Service for funding Emerald Ash Borer University. And with that, I will take any questions.
Yep. I just like to remind anybody that if you would like to ask a question rather than write it, you can just indicate so in the chat, and then we'll give you permission to actually to speak. So thank you very much for this webinar, Elizabeth. It was really very enlightening. It's nice to know that what you're doing has lots of multipliers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go read through some of the questions that we've had, and then those of you who want to can continue to add questions in the chat, and I'll just keep on going through it. I also noticed that somebody has a Q&A question in the Q&A, so I'll jump into that one there later as well. Okay, John Obermeyer wanted to know, you say you're giving CEUs for certified crops advisors and such. CEUs, are they for what audiences are getting the CEUs and what proportion are taking it?
So the CEUs that we offer we have first for arborists, so certified arborists, certified foresters, and then pesticide applicators. We have 3A, and then sometimes some of the other ones actually overlap as well. And then for anyone else who has, so those are the ones we get pre-approval for. And then for anyone else who has any other organization, we give them a certificate of attendance if they want it. I don't know off the top of my head the proportion of people who ask for CEUs. That's something that would be worth looking into, just so that I actually have that number. But I would say it fluctuates between about 10 and 20%, depending on the particular webinar. Right now, the past several webinars we've been getting a lot of requests for CEUs, I think in part because people aren't they're not able to do in-person stuff, so they're really casting a wide net to try and figure out any way they can to get those credits. But in a normal year, I would say it's about 10 to 20%.
Right, and most of the people, I guess, who are going to do it just depends on the topic. So when we do something about invasive weeds, you're going to get a category 2 for the invasive weeds management situation, sort of a thing.
Mhm.
All right, some more questions that we have here are, let's see. Patty Keating wanted to know if you could share the slides with her. She's an extension educator in community development, and I take by your smile that's a yes.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Just shoot me an email so that I've got your contact information, and I'd be happy to share it with you.
Uh, John Overmeyer had another question about the YouTube videos.
Mhm.
So are the comments turned off for the YouTube videos, or are they left open?
Our comments are left open. We don't get a lot of comments. So on one hand, we don't get a lot of people necessarily asking questions on the YouTube videos, although we occasionally do. But on the other hand, that means we don't have to deal with as much the darker side of YouTube. That is something to consider when you're posting videos on YouTube, though. Sometimes comments can be good and constructive, and sometimes it's unpleasant to deal with, to say the least.
Yes, so, well, unfortunately, we're all aware of that sort of a thing. Okay, let's see. So now there's a question in the Q&A. Let's see what it says. Steve Yannick, how will you change the way you promote, present, archive your outreach programs based on your survey results? So, yeah, how you change the way that you promote, present, and archive your outreach programs based on your survey results.
Um, so in terms of promoting, one thing that I do actively check each at the end of each semester, because usually that's when I go back and I compile everything that we've presented, is I try to make sure that we're reaching those audiences that we really want to reach. And if we don't have those people showing up in our surveys, so say we don't have a lot of master gardeners filling out our surveys, I will make more of an effort to reach master gardeners. Or if I notice in a particular year that we're say only getting people from Indiana and Ohio, I will more actively reach out to other states and promote it in other states. Trying to think of I mean, we'll also change the content a little bit depending on, occasionally people will ask for specific topics that they want us to cover. So we'll change it that way. Um, I'm trying to think. I think that answers the question. If you want more details, or if you have more questions, throw that in the chat and I'll try and answer it.
Uh, there's yep. So Steve, if you want to have a clarification, just throw that one in there. Greg Shaner, former faculty member in plant pathology, had a question about is teaching lay people how to scout for a newly introduced organism one of the most challenging educational objectives?
Um, I would say it is. It's pretty challenging. For us though, right now, what's more difficult is for emerald ash borer, the way that it kills ash trees, it makes the trees incredibly dangerous to remove. So you have to get someone who really is specialized in tree removal to come in and do that. And people are very resistant to that idea. I get a lot of pushback on people who don't want to pay to have their tree removed because they've been doing it for 50 years. They know how to cut down a tree. So that is one of the more challenging things that we deal with. But yeah, getting lay people to report these insects can be difficult. Some of that is just they don't necessarily notice. Some of that is some people are very insistent that what they found is an invasive species and it's not, although we'd much rather get those reports than have someone not send in a report. Sometimes there's an issue of people not remembering the right place to send the information. So we try to have as many venues as possible and kind of connect anyone in the state who might be contacted with the network so that that information gets to the right person. But yeah, it's challenging, and it also gets back to that attention issue. Like, why why should they bother sit down and learn what a spotted lanternfly or an Asian longhorn beetle looks like when they're being pulled in a million directions at once?
Okay, that pretty much does all the. I've gone through all the chat questions and all the Q&A. So if we have no more questions, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Elizabeth for a very illuminating seminar, and I hope you all have a nice week.
Yeah, and if anyone has a question they think of later, or wants to follow up, please feel free to contact me. Oh, I did mean to mention, and I forgot this earlier. If you do take the recommendation about the short 5-minute videos, let me know. I'd love to work with you to try and collect some data on that so we have a decent data set about it and maybe publish a short paper about it in the future. So if anyone's interested in that, please get in touch with me. And thank you again.
Thanks so much.